Hello, and welcome to SimCast, the higher education simulation podcast. My name's Tony Jeremy. I'm the academic lead for clinical skills and simulation in the School of Health Sciences at UEA Norwich.
Hi, my name's Lawrence Hill, and I'm the chair of the school's simulation group here at UEA Norwich.
So, Lawrence, this episode we've titled Planning Sim Using Shell to Plan Your Sim Sessions.
Yes, we have, and we mentioned Shell in a previous SimCast, and we wanted to use this SimCast as an opportunity to show all of you guys out there who are delivering simulation in higher education just how we have chosen to structure organising simulation sessions.
Great, thank you. So, if you enjoyed this video, please give us a like. Equally so, if you didn't enjoy the video, give us a dislike, but let us know in the comments why. We really appreciate your feedback, and we're always keen to try and improve things. If you want to keep up to date with all things sim, please subscribe, and don't forget to check that notification bell.
All right, so we're actually going to start this SimCast with a little vignette, aren't we? We wanted to try and give it a little bit of context and try and make it feel real and applied.
Yeah, okay. So let's get to it then. So in this scenario, we've got Callum. Callum's a new clinical skills lecturer, and he's been tasked with planning the delivery of an advanced life support simulation training to final year BSc paramedic students. Callum's been given an allotted session in an otherwise packed curriculum, and he has to deliver the learning over one day to, let's say, a medium-sized cohort of around 30 to 40 learners. Mm-hmm. Each learner needs to actively participate in the sim in order to satisfy some kind of professional regulatory proficiency.
Yeah, like you've got to do it to demonstrate, to go out to practice safely. In order to be able to do that in practice, each paramedic student's got to demonstrate they can do it.
Yeah. So Callum has been given 4 rooms for the whole day, which he can run the sim in. Some of those rooms are kind of immersive spaces that look like clinical environments. Some are just basic rooms. Mm-hmm. Other than that, other than the room bookings, there is a blank slate. And again, Callum is thinking, well, where do I start? Yeah,
so Callum's got a blank sheet of paper. How am I going to get 30 to 40 people through this simulation training experience in a kind of consistent and effective way?
Yeah, so there's lots to think about here. There's lots potentially, particularly for a new academic, you could potentially miss.
Yeah, definitely. There's tons to think about, isn't there? You've got multiple learners, multiple rooms. You've got to think about all of the stuff that you're going to need to run effective simulations. You know, it's a really complex task when you try and break it down. So where would you start?
Well, I think historically, and looking at it myself, I've thought I've been in that situation where I'm like, I need to plan this. I've got all these things. Where do I start? And there's lots of potential pitfalls. So I would immediately think, well, I'm going to need some help. I need some people to be involved. And I'd probably think about that, and I'd get obsessed with thinking about who I need to get. And
then you're like, oh, I've got to get all this stuff. I need all of the equipment. And you're like, oh, okay, so I know I'm going to need a resus mannequin, and I'm going to need some drugs, and I'm going to need a response bag. And then you get distracted and you're like, but what about the rooms? What rooms am I going to have to do it in?
Yeah, and there might be some things, particularly as a new lecturer, that completely slip your mind altogether.
Yeah.
So what we're suggesting is using some kind of semi-structured approach, and we think that the shell model would be perfect for that.
Yeah, we started using it, didn't we, after a conversation, and it is just a really useful tool that we found for organising all of the things that you need to think about, that one needs to think about to make sure that you don't drop any balls, basically.
Yeah, and it's really important because we talk about being a good simulation citizen, and part of that, particularly if you're planning simulation, is making sure that you've really considered things so that if for example, in this situation where you're likely to need help, the people that are going to be helping you feel like things have been prepared.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you are invited to be a educator in a simulation event, when you turn up and everything seems chilled and relaxed, and you've got a lead instructor giving you a really clear brief, and they've got time on their hands, and they've allowed time to settle the learners in and sit them down and give them a briefing, and everything's where it should be, it just engenders this feeling of this is going to be a good day, this is going to be a relaxing day, I'm going to enjoy it, and learning is going to take place.
And that filters down to the learners as well, doesn't
100%. It absolutely does. If you get there and you're not entirely sure what you're going to be doing, and you're a little bit uneasy, and the lead facilitator is a little bit on edge because they haven't quite got all their ducks in a row, the tension starts to build, and the students absolutely pick up on that, and they feel it, and then they get nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've been involved in a really well-planned sim, we'd love to know what made the difference. So again, just stick some ideas in the comments below.
Yeah, what is the single thing that makes the biggest difference to you if you turn up as a simulation educator, and what is it that makes it feel like a well-organised, smoothly run, well-oiled event?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember, when in higher education, we're dealing with individuals, academics who are wearing multiple hats, spinning multiple plates simultaneously, many of which are probably wobbling as well.
Yeah.
So in some situations, people just want to be able to turn up and get on with things.
Yeah, absolutely right. So what can we do to try and bring some semblance of kind of organisation to this? You know, how can we use that shell model to help to structure that preparation for the simulation event?
So let's break it down into each category. So if we look at it in terms of the way that the acronym works, we'll look at S first, which is for software. So we can think about this in terms of curriculum design, any kind of pieces of information, any background stuff to make the simulation work. And certainly from a planning point of view, this is quite an important area.
Oh, absolutely. You know, we've said in a previous SimCast about the importance of the learning outcomes, about the learning outcomes being central to the simulation event, any learning event, but, simulation. And making sure that they are, clear and precise and achievable and appropriate for the level of the learners is a really important part of getting the software part right. And
in Callum's scenario, the learning outcomes are almost forcing his hand.
Yeah, they are, for sure. They have to. The learners will have to demonstrate. This will be one of the action verbs you'd expect to find in this set of learning outcomes is going to be demonstrate, because everyone has to do it. So that has a bearing. The software, the learning outcome, has a bearing on the kind of way that Callum's going to need to organise this simulation event.
Yeah. So we know he's got 4 rooms. We know there is the likelihood with the size of the cohort size, 30 to 40 learners, that there's going to be multiple rooms of simulation happening simultaneously. It doesn't have to be like that, but it's probably the best way to deal with a larger size cohort, particularly with the limited time that Callum has.
Yeah.
So for me, because we're going to need other people, a big part of software is that early correspondence, getting the emails out there, making sure that the communication is nice and clear so that if anyone has given up their time to come and help as a simulation facilitator, they're really, really nice and clear in terms of what the requirements are, how long they're needed for, all of those little pieces of information.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We know that the academics delivering simulation, or if you've got, visiting lecturers or associate tutors or flying faculty coming in, in an ideal world, you'll have all of the information for them prepped and ready in advance, the intended learning outcomes for each of the simulations, perhaps the clinical course of some of the simulations,
how the day is going to run, timings, that kind of thing,
to manage expectations so that those people coming in are going to have a clear sense of what they can expect from the day. So you set out with those intentions of having that ready and prepared in advance.
It might mean the difference actually between someone saying yes and no, because if they can dip out at lunchtime to attend to other things, which is often the way with academics in higher education, that might mean the difference between them saying yes or no, or even just saying, well, I can help you for the morning, but not the afternoon. Yeah. And that just gives Callum options, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So having that information early doors and also having it prepped and ready to go, a week or a couple of weeks in advance, having already booked these people to come and facilitate, the hope is that they're going to have the time to review this stuff. But also I think as the lead facilitator, we have to have an expectation that people might not necessarily have the time to do that preparation and to do that reading. So we've got to make double sure that we've got it absolutely nailed in terms of how it's going to run.
So being a good simulation citizen in this this respect is doing plenty of planning so that people have the information ahead of time, but also planning for the fact that as busy academics or other individuals, they might well just turn up unprepared.
Yeah, sure. And that's okay. And we have to, and part of the software planning, part of getting the information right is planning that schedule for how you're going to run the students with perhaps a little bit of flexibility. Because it's not necessarily just the faculty that are going to come in and throw you maybe a couple of, I don't want to say curveballs, but, introduce variables. The learners might as well. You might find that actually what should be a cohort of 30, there's been some kind of breakout of some kind of illness, and actually you're down to 30. So building some flexibility into that software, that planning phase is important too. But you've got, let's say, 40 students coming to this session. What are your choices in terms of how you structure that day?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? There's a couple of ways you could look at it. I think because everyone has to actively be involved, Callum's options are a little bit more limited. He needs to get through the numbers. Mm-hmm. So he's going to have to run rooms of simulation simultaneously.
Yeah.
If they didn't have to all actively be involved, you could have a room with the simulation linked to a debrief space, for example. And if you've got the luxury of having an audio-visual solution, which means that you can watch and stream things remotely, there's a different approach to it. Again, both have got positives and negatives in terms of how simulation is delivered, the learning that comes from it. And again, going without wanting to sound like a broken record, it again depends on what your learning outcomes are.
Yeah.
If it's more of a focus on non-technical skills, the observer role becomes much more powerful than actively participating. Mm-hmm. So there are options there.
Yeah, I mean, Callum could bring all 40 learners in at 9 o'clock.
Yes.
Run a number of simulations over the course of the morning, break the students for lunch, and then run another set of scenarios in the afternoon, or another set of simulations.
Or he could split the cohort into two and do kind of an AM PM session.
Yeah, and it's going to depend, doesn't it, on what you want to get out of that session, how much you think is enough exposure in order to hit those learning outcomes.
Yeah, and each of those setups may end up having different what am I trying to think of? Different requirements in terms of faculty resourcing and equipment and those kind of things as well. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different ways to skin a cat, and the same can be said for how planning simulation in that respect.
Yeah, no, definitely. So if I were Callum, I think what I'd be looking at would be an AM and a PM session.
Okay.
I'd have half the learners come in the morning, so I've got 20 learners coming in the morning, and I'll have 20 learners coming in the afternoon.
It makes things more manageable, particularly if you've got 4 rooms.
Yeah, particularly if you've got 4 rooms. So we'd be looking at 5 students per group, and if a couple of students dropped out, what I might have is I might say, actually, do you know what, I'm going to peg this back to 3 rooms. I'm going to give one of my faculty
the gift of free
time this morning or this afternoon. And what academic isn't going to say yes, please to that? Yeah, exactly. So, that's how I would, I think, organise it to start with, and then I'd probably go from there. So that would be my kind of template plan. Would be AM and PM, half the learners morning, half the learners in the afternoon.
That sounds sensible. It's not the only way to do it, but it certainly sounds like a sensible solution to the conundrum that Callum's in. Let's move on, because we do need to go through the rest of the shell model. So hardware. So undoubtedly, Callum needs to book some kind of equipment to do the physical aspect of advanced life support. And the likelihood is he's going to use an ALS level patient simulator to achieve that. Yeah,
it's really important to plan the equipment that you intend to use to the intended learning outcomes of the simulation. If, what Callum's going for here is a kind of immersive, interactive, authentic type simulation, there are definitely disadvantages to using, just the sort of head and torso of a resuscian, because immediately we're trying to generate this fiction contract with students, and they'll see that, and already the kind of the spell is broken in terms of simulation buy-in. So thinking about what sort of level of fidelity, if you will, what kind of level of, quality of the actual physical hardware is kind of important. Because if this was just a part-task training, if Callum just wanted people to practice their BLS, wouldn't be a great deal of point in asking the support team, the simulation technicians to haul out all of the super Gucci expensive equipment. That would be unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of technicians, the likelihood is, again, in most simulation centres, there will be some kind of technical support to help you with that. What does Callum need to think about in terms of booking equipment?
Yeah, great question. So, Callum may be in a busy simulation centre, as we are, and as I'm sure many people are who are listening onto this, who there may be competing demands on that equipment. So the earlier really that it's possible to communicate to these lab technicians or the simulation technicians roughly what kind of equipment is needed and the time frame that it's needed is going to allow them to balance the needs of the simulation center to make sure that one group of students doesn't end up with all of the equipment and another ends up really impoverished in terms of access to equipment. So having that conversation with sim techs and saying, guys, this is what I want to achieve. What do you think?
Because they're obviously the experts in the field when it comes to that.
100%.
What this patient simulator can and can't do, what equipment might be available, and also their knowledge and understanding of what else is happening on different programs, different curricula, different times of the day, those kind of things.
Yeah, and as the educator trying to organise this simulation event, we're thinking about our shell model, which is the equipment that I need, the people that I need, the rooms that I need. But more often than not, somebody in that lab technician, simulation technician role is looking at
their own shell model,
the bigger picture, the bigger shell model, which is how do all of these competing programs kind of slot in. So having that conversation just makes sure that what we're doing, which needs to be an effective learning experience, doesn't compromise somebody else's.
When does Callum have this conversation?
As early as he can, but probably not years in advance. I mean, probably 6 months, 3 months maybe.
It needs to be early, doesn't it?
Needs to be early.
I've seen both happen. I've seen really good planning where the technical team are involved nice and early. Yeah. And surprise, surprise, things tend to run quite smoothly.
Yeah, one of the technical guys in here at UEA came up with a great comment in discussion about this recently. And he said, you wouldn't ask an academic to teach a session with 2 days' notice.
No.
You would give them enough time to prepare, to think about it, to situate the session within the wider curriculum. And I think it's really fair to say that exactly the same kind of principles apply to the technical side.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that I've learned a great deal from in terms of working closer with our technical team is it's not just about grabbing a piece of kit and equipment from a shelf somewhere. No. There is so much more involved that as an academic, I don't even think about.
No, like for example, something that I really have learned to appreciate as part of, this simulation center becoming increased in complexity is the amount of work, the unseen work that goes on after the session finishes. Like 4 o'clock, simulation ends, and we're like, great, that's fantastic. Great day of simulation, everyone. Thanks very much.
But the tidy up just begins.
Yeah, and the prep for the next day.
Yeah.
And so, if someone then has added a request 24 hours before my simulation starts, these lab tech guys are now having to think about how they then reconcile that request with everything that was already planned for the next day. And that very quickly adds up to, at risk of being unreasonable demands, or at least stressful demands that can be avoided.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Just finally on hardware, it's just worth bearing in mind if you are using the technology and you are unfamiliar with it, you might need extra help from the technical team in terms of actually support running it during a simulation. And depending on where you work, that support may or may not be unavailable depending on what the technical team do. But it's just, again, something worth bearing in mind.
It's also worth bearing in mind that this is where we have a software-hardware interface, that actually some of that technical support could indeed happen at a time in advance if perhaps you've got some of that tech support and you're looking at programming scenarios so that you've got clinical courses already programmed in. But you can't do that on the morning or in the week before because it takes time, like computer programming
particularly if you then have to then replicate that over 4 rooms, 4 different pieces of kit and equipment. The scenarios might have to be loaded on.
I bet you can't copy paste that.
No, absolutely not. Okay, let's move on to environment. So this was the bit where Callum kind of had some help, because the rooms had already been booked. But getting the right rooms and timetabling them, particularly in a busy simulation centre, I mean, it's a whole podcast in itself, is trying to timetable.
So when we set up this simulation centre, when the School of Health Sciences at UEA set up the simulation centre, we very soon realised that a huge amount of the conversation in the early days of our simulation group, so we have a group which has representation from all of the kind of key programs, all of the programs really, the technical support, local support team. We realised early on we were going to have to spend a long time talking about timetabling.
Rooms, resources, those kind of things, yeah.
Because the environment itself, the physical space, the accommodation in which simulation needs to take place is essential. And if left too long, it becomes, a major hurdle or bottleneck in terms of delivering what you want to deliver.
Yeah, one of the challenges that we've faced is, again, the programs that we support quite often will be, in terms of internal organisation, is siloed in its approach, and that's one of the things that we've tried to achieve with the Sim Group, is to try and break down those barriers. But even with an active participation and involvement with that, is still really, really challenging because of just the day-to-day running of programs and courses in higher education.
It's the nature of complex systems that you can try and reduce it, but it's not that easy to completely do that. So getting that booking ahead of time, and whenever your institution does that process, it's managing to get far enough ahead to think, how do I want to deliver this session? Do I need 3 rooms? Do I need 4 rooms? Do I need 6 rooms in order to do what I need to do?
Yeah. So Callum's hand has been forced. Yeah. Let's say there's 4 rooms available. There's nothing else available. And in our vignette, Callum had a mixture. So some were like high immersion, high reality, look and feel like a real clinical setting. Others akin to maybe a seminar room or whatever room was available. Mm-hmm. How does Callum think about planning this in terms of ensuring equity of the space, which arguably could be really influential in terms of the level of fidelity and immersion that a learner might experience in a simulation session like this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and not necessarily a straightforward one to get completely right. Affording students that equality of opportunity in terms of access to the best equipment is something that we have to wrestle with and to try and get right. I'd suggest that one way that Callum could approach this problem is to rotate the students around the different groups, the different rooms, which in turn introduces
complexity,
fresh challenges,
timings, those kind of things all need to be considered.
Yeah, because these things always take longer than you think. Because, someone needs to get a drink, or the facilitator needs to go and get a cup of tea, or, there's normal human stuff that needs to happen in between simulations taking place. And having students move around the building, it depends how far apart these rooms are. So factoring that in is kind of important. So I would say probably Callum ought to maybe apply a kind of a stoic principle here and just think, actually, what is essential for me to do in order to hit these learning outcomes? And can I do less better? Rather than perhaps having 10 different spaces, well, you've got 4 different spaces, but, are there 2 equivalent rooms? Is it possible to do 2 scenarios in the low-tech room and then 2 in the high-tech room? Is there a way that he can rotate the students around in such a way that they get something approaching an equitable experience? Yeah,
and what Callum might need to do is run it, see how it works, and then reevaluate for next time, because there's undoubtedly some kind of learning that they might glean from this.
Yeah, exactly. The worst thing that can happen is that he's going to learn something for next time.
So we've kind of got a software environment interface in terms of what Callum needs to do, planning and thinking about the space. You talked about timings, so I just want to go off on a tangent slightly. Would you build much redundancy into your day, into your AM or your PM session, in terms of thinking about if there is a delay or if this sim overruns, or, do you drop the 4th scenario if you've run out of time? How would you plan that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because if, as is the case that Callum's trying to do, he wants to organise kind of, if we're thinking about the scale of simulation kind of learning experiences from sort of pure theory, which wouldn't really be simulation, to sort of part task training to full simulation. As we kind of increase in the fidelity, there is much more likelihood of quite profound unintended learning outcomes coming out. There might be a need for a very deep debrief in what happens in maybe that first or that second
and also
simulation.
an increased risk of things not going to plan.
Yeah, absolutely. There might be something significant that happens. Or alternatively, learners might be super well prepped. They might have a high degree of confidence and competence coming into the simulation. And actually, they might run through the first 1, 2, and 3 simulations. And you're actually kind of, as the lead facilitator, you might be kind of reassured that, actually they're doing okay. Running another kind of repetition of the simulation might not actually help contribute to these learners going away with a sense that they've achieved something and they've done well. So I would say we shouldn't just slavishly stick to the plan and actually be prepared to flex it and adjust it if needs be. And the same goes if this first scenario goes completely Pete-tong and we've got big feelings that need to be picked up from the students and maybe some serious clinical issues that occur. We have to spend the time unpacking that and be ready to maybe flex that second simulation and say, do you know what, we're going to learn more from unpacking this simulation than we might from just running another one.
Yeah, and I've definitely been in situations before where we have been slaves to the format. And so we've had to run the 4 scenarios. And unfortunately, what always gets compromised in that is the debrief. That it gets cut short, and of course that's where arguably a majority of the learning takes place.
Yeah.
So having that flexibility is really, really important.
We see this, and I don't mean to digress, but we see this on teaching on Resource Council ALS courses as well.
It's jam-packed, isn't it?
It's so intense. There's so much to get through. And if there are learning points, it's often that debrief that gets squeezed. And, it's really nice to ensure that you've got the flexibility in your timetable because you're not constrained by a one-day EALS course kind of format where you've got, 10 hours to get through the whole thing. Actually, we choose as the organisers of these simulations how they're organised. There's not like a preset national format that has to be stuck to for various reasons. So we should use that and use a bit of creativity and flexibility to be just that,
so
flexible.
Callum needs to make sure that point is captured quite nicely in the faculty briefing at the beginning of the session. Particularly if multiple rooms are running simultaneously, and this is a nice segue into LIVEWARE. So looking at the facilitators, who they've got, the level of ability and how well they're briefed. Yeah. So let's move on to LIVEWARE. So Callum needs some help and support. He needs some facilitators. He put the call out in plenty of time and has got some responses. Yeah. So what do we need to consider?
Well, I mean, for a start, we've got at least two groups of LIVEWARE. So we have the faculty side and we have the student or the learner side as well. So focusing on the facilitators for a second, and within that, there's all of the additional staff as well, the technical support and potential confederates. But in terms of those facilitators, thinking about who you've got and thinking about what the intended outcomes are for any given. If you've got someone who's an expert in hypothermia, or they've got some experience of wilderness medicine, having them in the hypothermia scenario makes sense to me.
Okay.
So you might want to kind of try and align people's expertise with the particular scenarios they're running.
So it sounds like we're moving in a situation where Callum has got certain rooms for certain scenarios and maybe even facilitators for those scenarios in that room, and then individuals, the learners, will then rotate through the different scenarios. Because you could have it where the learners stay in the same room, you run 4 different scenarios, you have the same facilitator. And again, there's pros and cons to both, isn't there?
Oh, definitely.
If you've got the same facilitator, you build a rapport up throughout the afternoon or the morning, and that might help with learners' concerns around evaluation, apprehension, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it will probably help to sort of flatten the hierarchy as well, if there is one, that over time that's just going to kind of level out.
But they may not have, like you say, the prerequisite expertise to facilitate a particular scenario, particularly if it's like a niche area.
Yeah.
With
another
a
potential, disadvantage there is that the that you might have kind of quite a variation in those different characters. You know, you might have some of these facilitators who are really sort of dove-like facilitators and everything's marvelous and well done. And you might get others who are real hawkish, kind of severe kind of facilitators. Or
and
even
you might even get the velociraptor.
Yeah, the velociraptor facilitator is, you know, often these people are super accurate and, you know, and really kind of profoundly good at what they do. And sometimes through that can be a little bit fierce and a little bit kind of hard, and it's good to get that. It's good to get that mix of experiences.
If you've got one room with the velociraptor for the whole morning or afternoon, they might come out of it battered and bruised.
Exactly. And equally, if you spend the whole day with your dove-like facilitator,
all you're going to get,
you might come out feeling really wonderful, but perhaps, you know, not have achieved some of the learning outcomes that maybe some more of the hawkish facilitators might have picked out. Maybe the slightly more critical might say, well, actually, you know, how long were you off the chest in that particular situation? And, you know, what was the rest of your team doing at that stage? And I think you need that mix. So that kind of blend of experience is kind of part of it. And each facilitator will have different kind of turns of phrase or little just golden nuggets or little pearls of wisdom that you don't want people to miss out on.
So I'm going to ask a loaded question here, which I think I already know the answer to. How many people does Callum have in a room as a facilitator? And let's be realistic.
Yeah. So as in terms of facilitators, I think the reality of being a simulation educator working in higher education is that you are going to be pegged back to a single facilitator.
Okay.
I think that's the truth, isn't it? You know, we might want to have someone who's running the tech and another person who's facilitating the sim and the debrief. But the reality is that it's probably going to be you, and you're going to be wearing multiple hats.
Yeah, you're going to need a large faculty if you've got, what? So we're talking about 8. So if we went 2 facilitators, which would be lovely, you've got 8 facilitators, plus probably Callum, who's trying to organise and coordinate the whole thing. Maybe some confederates as well. The numbers start to add up. So
if it wasn't so important that everybody did the simulation, so to speak, if it wasn't so important that everybody was involved and you could increase the learner groups, having a second facilitator becomes much more viable very quickly.
Yeah. I personally love a second facilitator. It makes things so much easier, but I've been in multiple situations where I've been the only one. And like you say, multiple hats. So I'm trying to facilitate. I'm trying to brief my participants. I'm trying to get the technology to work seamlessly so it doesn't subtract from the immersion or the reality. And in this situation, it might be queuing up a different arrhythmia or, you know, whether it's a shockable or non-shockable rhythm. I've also got to try and think about really pertinent, important points to come back to in the debrief. Just thinking about it, my cognitive bandwidth is is struggling.
And it's really hard. You know, what we do, you know, simulation is a really kind of complex metacognitive skill that takes that, you know, that balance of, you know, the plate spinning kind of analogy. You have to be ready to do that.
So anything I think we can do to make that job easier, really Callum should be thinking about.
Yeah.
So planning the technology so that it is pre-programmed, and actually it's a few button presses rather than changing things on the fly, which you know, a lot of the patient simulators or the arrhythmia defibrillators, those kind of things, they have both types, don't they? It will just mean the facilitation should be a little bit more robust.
Yeah. And yeah, I completely agree that having multiple facilitators is extremely useful, particularly around debrief as well, because it's just so helpful to have that kind of conversation.
Co-debriefing is so beneficial, isn't it?
It seems to flatten or lower the risk of tutorial mode.
Yes,
because the other facilitator, the other debriefer can also help to moderate if the other debriefer starts doing that.
You've picked me up on it before. You're leaning in, Tony.
Well, we were teaching a simulation course, and it was But it's a case in point of how actually it's that extra perspective.
Yes.
And that can really help too. So thinking about the facilitators and their relative expertise and their degree of ferocity as educators, but also getting a blend of experiences for learners is important.
So again, just a couple of other areas in terms of LIVEWARE, people that need to be considered. Obviously, we've got the learners themselves. But that goes back to things like learning outcomes. We've talked a little bit about technical staff. We need to make sure that we've notified them nice and early. Mm-hmm. We've involved them with the planning. And again, if they're involved in the delivery, fantastic as well. Mm-hmm. Actors and confederates. I mean, if I'm Callum and I'm a new academic, I'm thinking straight away, well, I just need a patient simulator because it's an ALS scenario. But how could actors and confederates add realism and further fidelity to these scenarios?
Yeah, I love using actors and confederates in simulation, and often I'll use that as a way of involving other students in the group and giving them a role. So playing the part of concerned family members or lay people or bystanders, delivering chest compressions, just adding in, aspects of normal clinical practice that make it feel more authentic. Having to ask someone to stop so that you can confirm cardiac arrest is a really, because that's the sort of thing that happens out there in the real world. Someone's enthusiastically doing chest compressions on someone who perhaps may or may not have a cardiac output. Giving students the opportunity to rehearse that, oh, thank you very much, you're doing a great job, but could you just stop for me a second, is really useful. In the same way that, the family member, the person there perhaps who, is able to provide a little bit of history about what's happened, or to maybe not interfere and intervene, but to be there and to be part of the dynamic that needs to be managed.
And for Callum, as he's dealing with third year students, we can assume that there's a certain amount of prerequisite knowledge and expertise. They've got some concrete experiences. They've probably been on placements. So he could legitimately look at using learners in that actor confederate role. Whereas if it was a first year student, might be thinking, well, I might need another facilitator or even, an actor to play that role, because the level of knowledge base and confidence to deliver a really important role in simulation might be lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, being aware of the students, the student body as LIVEWARE and what their relative experience is.
Fantastic performances from learners in the past.
Some learners really enjoy that, don't they? They really enjoy the opportunity to get into role and to do stuff, and it does add to it, and it makes it more fun. And again, like we said on the previous video, simulation should be serious, but it should be fun. It should be immersive. It should be something that people kind of look forward to doing, not necessarily something they feel like they've got to do.
The last thing that Callum could consider, and this is a luxury, it really is, particularly in higher education, is whether he has any support staff to help him with the organisation and planning. And again, it's just making sure that the simple things like communication is really nailed down, that the messages go out there, and how the support staff can help Callum with organising it. But it is a luxury.
Yeah, and it may not be that available, depending on the organisation that you work for, the resources that you have to hand. But certainly, if you've got a clear idea of what you want to plan and you've got someone who can help you administer that, then that is going to help to bring everything together.
Okay, thank you.
Talking of bringing it all together, we should probably try and sort of round it up and bring
it feels
it
like
to
we've
a close.
come to a natural conclusion. We've gone through the shell model. We by no means have covered everything, and I think what we can kind of take away from the video is that planning simulation is incredibly complex. As with many things in simulation, there's lots and lots of things to consider. So having some kind of structure to plan that round, it can be really, really beneficial.
I completely agree. And using software, hardware, LIVEWARE and environment as a model for doing that just makes sure that in the way that we've approached that task, we don't make too many errors.
Hopefully. If you're watching and you think there's anything obvious that we've missed, please pop it in the comments below.
Yeah, or if you've got a alternative way of organising your simulation events and you think we're missing a trick, let us know, because we'd love to hear about that.
So thank you so much for watching. We hope you found it interesting, and we can't wait to see you in the next one.
Thanks very much, folks. Bye for now.